The security monitor flickered in the darkness of Gerald Smith's office, casting pale blue light across his exhausted face. It was 2:47 a.m. and he hadn't slept properly in weeks, maybe months. He couldn't remember anymore. The coffee in his hand had gone cold hours ago, but he barely noticed as he watched the screen showing camera 7, the one positioned in his twin son's bedroom. She was there again. Samantha Brown, the new caregiver, the eighth person he'd hired in 3 years, though he'd already decided she'd probably be gone within a month like all the others. She was kneeling between the two small beds where Mason and Henry slept or tried to sleep. At 4 years old, his boys still woke screaming most nights, trapped in nightmares about twisted metal and broken glass, about the mother they barely remembered but whose absence haunted them like a ghost. Gerald leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he watched Samantha reach out and gently brush the hair from Mason's forehead. The boy had been crying again. Gerald could see the tear tracks on his small face even through the grainy camera feed. What was she doing? He'd seen caregivers comfort his sons before, seen them go through the motions of care that their generous salaries demanded. But this felt different somehow. Then she began to sing. Gerald's coffee cup slipped from his fingers. It shattered on the hardwood floor, ceramic shards scattering across his office, dark liquid spreading like spilled ink. But he didn't move. He couldn't. Because the song she was singing, that melody, those exact words, they were impossible. Hush now, little ones, the stars are shining bright. Mama's love surrounds you through the darkest night. Even when you cannot see me, I am always near. In every gentle whisper, in every falling tear. His legs gave out. Gerald fell to his knees among the broken pieces of his coffee mug, and for the first time in 3 years, since the night that destroyed everything, he wept. Not quiet tears. Deep, wrenching sobs that tore from somewhere so deep inside him that he'd forgotten that place existed. Because that song, Rachel's song, the lullaby she'd made up when the twins were babies, the one she'd sung every single night until the night she died, no one else knew it. No one. He'd never told anyone about it, had never heard her sing it to anyone but their sons, never even recorded it. So how did Samantha Brown know it? Gerald Smith's house was a monument to grief disguised as luxury. 15,000 square feet of marble and hardwood, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the London skyline, furniture that cost more than most people's cars. But money couldn't buy back what he'd lost, and it couldn't fill the silence that had settled into every corner of his home like dust. It hadn't always been silent. 3 years ago, this house had been full of life. Mason and Henry, 18 months old then, racing through these halls on chubby toddler legs, crashing into furniture, into each other, into their parents' arms. Rachel chasing after them, laughing, that beautiful laugh that made everything better. Gerald coming home from work to chaos and joy and the kind of happiness he'd taken for granted because he'd thought it would last forever. But forever ended on September 17th, 2022, on a rain-slicked stretch of the M25 motorway when a lorry driver fell asleep at the wheel. The accident had been catastrophic. Rachel died at the scene, they told him later, though she'd lived long enough to know her sons were being pulled from the wreckage. The twins survived, but the injuries to their spines left them unable to walk. At 18 months old, they'd gone from running to wheelchairs, from laughter to silence, from joy to a trauma so deep that most days they barely spoke. Gerald had tried everything. The best surgeons in London, then specialists in America, Switzerland, Germany, experimental treatments that cost hundreds of thousands of pounds, physical therapy, occupational therapy, therapy for their minds and their bodies and their shattered little hearts. He'd spent millions, called in favors from every connection he had in the medical world, promised anything to anyone who might help his sons walk again. Nothing worked. The damage was too severe, the doctors said. Permanent, they said. Learn to adapt, they said, as if adapting to watching your children suffer was something that could be learned. So Gerald did what he knew how to do when the world fell apart. He built walls, not metaphorical ones, though he built those too. Real walls, security systems, cameras, 26 of them to be precise. Every hallway, every room, every corner of his house watched and recorded 24 hours a day. Because if he couldn't protect his family from drunk lorry drivers, if he couldn't make his sons walk again, if he couldn't bring back their mother, then at least he could control who entered their lives. At least he could watch, monitor, protect them. From the next inevitable betrayal. And betrayal, Gerald had learned, was inevitable. 7 people had walked through his door in 3 years claiming they wanted to help his sons. 7 people with impressive credentials and kind smiles and promises they had no intention of keeping. The first one, a highly recommended nanny from an exclusive agency, had sold photographs of Mason and Henry to a tabloid newspaper. Gerald still remembered opening the paper to see his sons' faces splashed across the front page. Tragic twins, inside the isolated life of Gerald Smith's disabled children. The second caregiver had stolen prescription medications, pocketing the pain medicine meant for his sons, and replacing it with placebos. Gerald had only discovered it when Mason woke up screaming from muscle spasms that should have been managed by his medication. The third had simply disappeared one night, taking with her detailed therapy schedules, medical records, and personal information about his family that she'd apparently planned to sell to the highest bidder. The police found her 3 days later, but the damage was done. The others had their own failures, their own small cruelties. One was merely neglectful, leaving the boys alone for hours while she made personal phone calls in another room. One spoke to them with barely concealed disgust, as if their disabilities were something shameful. One lasted only 2 weeks before declaring the job too depressing and walking out in the middle of her shift. Trust wasn't something Gerald gave anymore. It wasn't something he believed in. It was a weakness, a vulnerability, a door left unlocked for thieves and liars to walk through. So when Samantha Brown appeared at his door on a cold March morning with one small suitcase and an expression of such complete calm that it seemed almost unnatural, Gerald hadn't asked many questions. His security team had vetted her. She had the right credentials, the right experience, acceptable references from positions that checked out. She was just another risk, another person he'd have to monitor until she revealed her true nature. He'd handed her a contract loaded with non-disclosure agreements and behavioral clauses, showed her to the small apartment on the third floor where his staff lived, and introduced her to his sons with all the warmth of a business transaction. "This is Mason," he'd said, gesturing to the boy in the blue wheelchair, "and Henry. They require assistance with most daily activities. Their routine is documented in the binder in the kitchen. Medical emergencies are outlined in the red folder, questions." Samantha had knelt down to the boy's eye level, something that had surprised Gerald. Most caregivers either talked over them or treated them like infants. "Hello, Mason, hello, Henry," she'd said softly. "I'm Samantha, but you can call me Sam if you'd like. I'm very happy to meet you both." The boys hadn't responded. They rarely did to new people anymore. They'd learned, as children shouldn't have to learn, that people who came also left. But Samantha hadn't seemed bothered by their silence. She'd simply smiled, gentle and patient, and said, "That's okay. We'll get to know each other slowly, no rush." Gerald had watched through the cameras that first day as Samantha moved through the house, learning the layout, reading through the detailed instructions he'd left for her. She was efficient but not cold, careful but not afraid. She spoke to the boys even when they didn't respond, narrating what she was doing, asking questions she didn't expect them to answer, filling the silence with a voice that was soft but steady. By the end of the first week, Gerald had found nothing wrong with her. No suspicious phone calls, no strange visitors, no signs of the deception he was waiting for. She woke early, prepared the boys' breakfast exactly as instructed, helped them with their physical therapy exercises, read to them, sang to them, simple children's songs from a book she'd brought with her. By the end of the second week, Gerald had almost relaxed, almost convinced himself that maybe, possibly, this one might be different. Then came that night, the night everything changed. Gerald had been in his office going through financial reports when he heard it through the baby monitor, the cries. Mason first, then Henry joining in, both boys sobbing with the kind of desperate fear that still, 3 years later, broke Gerald's heart every time he heard it. He'd reached for his jacket, preparing to go to them himself, when he heard footsteps on the monitor. Quick, purposeful, Samantha's voice soothing, "I'm here, sweethearts, I'm right here." Gerald had paused, pulled up camera 7 on his computer. Watched as Samantha entered the boys' room in her pajamas, hair down, face soft with concern but not panic. She'd knelt between their beds, exactly as she did now, and placed one hand on each boy's shoulder. "Bad dreams?" she'd asked gently. "Mason H." Ad nodded, tears streaming down his face. Henry had just whimpered, his small hands clutching his blanket. "I get those too sometimes," Samantha had said. "Dreams can be scary, but you know what helps me?" The boys hadn't answered, but they'd been listening. "Remembering that I'm safe now, that the scary thing already happened and I survived it, that I'm stronger than I knew, just like you too." Then she'd begun to sing. And Gerald's world had shattered. Now kneeling on his office floor among the broken pieces of his coffee mug, Gerald's mind raced. How did she know that song? Rachel had made it up herself, silly rhymes about stars and love and always being near even when you couldn't be seen. She'd sung it every night, the last thing the boys heard before sleep, her voice carrying through the house like a blessing. Gerald had tried to sing it to them after Rachel died, but his voice always broke, the words catching in his throat until he couldn't continue. He'd stopped trying after the first few weeks. The pain was too much. But Samantha knew it, every word, every note, exactly as Rachel had sung it. Gerald stood on shaking legs, stepped over the broken mug, and walked out of his office. He moved through the dark house like a ghost, up the stairs, down the hall to the third floor where the staff quarters were located. Samantha's door was closed. He stood in front of it for a long moment, his hand raised to knock, to demand answers. But something stopped him, some instinct that said this required more than a direct confrontation. Because if Samantha had a connection to Rachel, if she'd somehow known his wife, why wouldn't she have mentioned it immediately? Why the secrecy? Unless there was something she didn't want him to know. Gerald lowered his hand. He'd wait until she was with the boys tomorrow until her room was empty. Then he'd find his answers. The next morning, Gerald watched on the monitors as Samantha took the boys outside to the garden. It was a warm spring day, and she'd bundled them into their wheelchairs and brought them out to the specially designed play area. Gerald had built accessible ramps, sensory equipment, everything the therapist had recommended. As soon as they were settled outside, Gerald moved. He climbed the stairs to the third floor, his heart pounding with an intensity he hadn't felt since the night of Rachel's death. This was wrong, he knew, invading her privacy, searching through her things, but the song haunted him, he had to understand. Samantha's room was small but tidy. A single bed neatly made, a small desk with a laptop that was closed, a bookshelf with a mix of medical textbooks and novels, a dresser with 4 drawers. Gerald started with the desk, opening it carefully, looking through papers, bills mostly, a lease agreement for an apartment she'd apparently given up when she took this position, nothing unusual. The bookshelf revealed nothing either. Medical texts on pediatric care, child development, trauma recovery, books that made sense for someone in her profession. He moved to the dresser. The bottom 2 drawers held clothes folded with military precision. The third drawer had personal items, jewelry, some letters from what appeared to be a friend overseas. The top drawer was different. When Gerald pulled it open, he saw a single item lying face down in the otherwise empty space. A photograph. His hands trembled as he reached for it. Every instinct told him that whatever was on the other side of this picture would change everything. He stood there for a moment, the photograph in his hand, face down, afraid to turn it over. Then he did. The image was dark nighttime, lit by emergency lights that cast everything in shades of red and blue. Samantha was younger in the photo, maybe by 2 or 3 years, and she was wearing a paramedic's uniform. She was kneeling on dark pavement beside what was clearly a car accident, an overturned vehicle, emergency workers in the background, her face exhausted and streaked with what looked like blood or dirt. But it was what was written on the back of the photograph that made Gerald's legs give out. He sat down hard on the edge of Samantha's bed, the photo shaking in his hands. Written in neat, careful handwriting. September 17th, 2022, M25, the night everything changed for me, Rachel's last words, find my boys, promise me, I promised. The room tilted. September 17th, 2022, the night of the accident, the night Rachel died, the night his sons' lives were destroyed. Samantha had been there. She wasn't just some random caregiver his security team had vetted and hired. She was the paramedic who'd responded to the crash, the one who'd pulled Mason and Henry from the wreckage, the one who'd been with Rachel in her final moments. And Rachel, his dying wife, had made her promise to find their sons. Gerald couldn't breathe. His chest felt like it was being crushed. He pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to make NSC of it, trying to understand what this meant. Why hadn't Samantha told him? Why walk into his house, sign his contract, pretend to be a stranger when she'd been there the worst night of his life, when she'd heard his wife's last words? His phone was in his hand before he'd consciously decided to reach for it. He opened the browser with shaking fingers, typed in the search, London Ambulance Service September 17, 2022 M25 accident. The articles flooded his screen. He'd read them all before, hundreds of times in the weeks and months after Rachel's death, reading and rereading, searching for details, for something that would make it make sense, though he knew nothing ever would. But now he was looking for something different. Now he was looking for Samantha. He scrolled through article after article. Tragic accident claims mother of 2, family devastated in M25 crash, lorry driver charged after fatal collision. Then he found it, a smaller article, local news, dated 3 days after the accident. First responders praised for heroic rescue efforts. There was a photograph at the bottom, 3 paramedics standing beside their ambulance, looking exhausted and traumatized in the way that only people who have seen terrible things can look. And there on the left was Samantha, younger, haunted, staring at the camera like she was looking through it into some dark place beyond. The caption read, Paramedic Samantha Brown, who assisted in the rescue of 2 children from the vehicle, was later hospitalized due to complications related to the incident. Hospitalized. Gerald's stomach dropped. He clicked on another link, searched deeper. Public records weren't always easy to find, but emergency incident reports were accessible if you knew where to look, and Gerald had the resources to look anywhere. He found the log an hour later, buried in administrative records. Simple, clinical language that didn't capture the horror of what it described. S. Brown, paramedic, admitted St. George's Hospital, 2352, emergency obstetrics, premature labor induced by physical trauma, patient 24 weeks gestation. 24 weeks pregnant. The words blurred in front of Gerald's eyes. He read them again, then again. Samantha had been 6 months pregnant when she responded to the accident, and something that happened that night, the physical trauma of the rescue, the stress, the horror of it all, had sent her into premature labor. Gerald searched further, his hands now steady with a horrible certainty of what he would find. Infant deceased, mother retained for observation and psychiatric evaluation. Samantha had lost her baby that night. The same night she'd saved his sons, she'd lost her own child. And now she was here, living in his house, caring for Mason and Henry like they were hers. Because Rachel had asked her to, because in Rachel's dying moments she'd made a promise. Gerald stood still holding the photograph. His mind was racing, unable to process the enormity of what he discovered. Downstairs, he could hear the boys' voices, excited about something, and Samantha responding with laughter. She'd sacrificed everything. Her career as a paramedic, if his research was right, she'd quit within months of the accident, her child, and now apparently years of her life to keep a promise made to a dying stranger. The question that burned in Gerald's mind wasn't why she'd hidden this from him anymore. The question was, what else was she hiding? What did she want from them? Because people didn't make sacrifices like this without wanting something in return. Did they? Gerald put the photograph back exactly where he'd found it, closed the drawer, and left Samantha's room. But he couldn't leave what he discovered there. It followed him through the house like a ghost, occupying every thought. That night, he sat in his office with the monitors glowing in front of him, but he wasn't watching for theft or deception anymore. He was watching for something else, something he couldn't quite name. Camera 7 showed the playroom. Samantha was helping Mason with his physical therapy exercises, the ones the specialist had designed to maintain what muscle function he still had. Simple movements, lifting his arms, reaching for soft blocks, trying to strengthen the connections between his brain and his body that the accident had damaged. Gerald had paid for the best therapists in Europe to design these exercises. He'd made sure they were performed every day, monitored by professionals. But watching his sons struggle through them always felt like watching them lose all over again. Watching their small faces contort with effort for movements that should be simple. Watching them fail. On the screen, Mason reached for a block. His hand trembled with the effort. The block slipped from his fingers, fell to the floor. "That's okay," Samantha's voice came through the audio feed, soft and encouraging. "Try again, sweetheart, you're doing so well." My son's face crumpled with frustration. At 4 years old, he didn't have the words to express how it felt to have a body that wouldn't obey him. He just knew it hurt, knew it was hard, knew he kept failing. But he reached for the block again. "That's it," Samantha encouraged. "You're so strong, Mason, you know that. Your mama would be so proud of how hard you're trying." Gerald went rigid. On the screen, Mason had frozen too. "You knew my mama," the boy's voice was small, confused. Samantha's expression didn't change, but Gerald saw something flicker in her eyes. Pain, maybe, or memory. "I met her once," Samantha said quietly, "a long time ago, and she told me something about you." "What?" Mason's eyes were wide now, desperate for any crumb of information about the mother he barely remembered. "She told me you were the bravest boy she'd ever known." Gerald's throat burned, tears pressed against his eyes. "She said that," Mason whispered. "She did." From his wheelchair nearby, Henry spoke for the first time in days. "What else did she say?" Samantha smiled, and it was the saddest smile Gerald had ever seen. "She said she loved you both more than the whole world, and that no matter what happened, she would always be watching over you, that even when you couldn't see her, she'd be there." Mason reached for the block again. This time his hand closed around it. He held it up, trembling but triumphant. "Look," he whispered, "I did it." "You did," Samantha said, and Gerald heard the catch in her voice. "She saw, I promise you she saw." Gerald turned off the monitor. He couldn't watch anymore. He stood, walked to the window overlooking the London skyline, the city lights spread out below him like fallen stars. Samantha had been there. In Rachel's final moments, she'd heard her last words, received her final request. And now she was here, speaking to his sons like she carried pieces of their mother with her. Because she did. She carried Rachel's last words, her last thoughts, her last act of love, asking a stranger to care for her children. But why the secrecy? Why not tell him from the beginning? Gerald's phone buzzed. A text from his investigator, a man he kept on retainer for sensitive matters. "Found hospital records. Brown was admitted same night as your wife, obstetrics emergency. Baby didn't survive. Patient required psychological intervention following loss, thought you should know." Gerald's legs gave out. He sat down hard in his chair. Psychological intervention. Samantha hadn't just lost her baby that night. She'd lost herself too, at least for a while, and she'd still come here, still found his sons, still kept her promise to a woman she'd met for minutes in the worst moment of both their lives. The question wasn't why she'd hidden it anymore. The question was, what had it cost her to be here? Gerald didn't sleep that night. He sat at his desk until dawn broke through the windows, the hospital records spread out in front of him like accusatory evidence. But evidence of what? Of dedication? Of obsession? Of grief so profound that it drove a woman to give up everything for children who weren't her own. Samantha Brown, admitted 23, 52, premature labor induced by trauma, infant female deceased at 24 weeks. 24 weeks, 6 months pregnant. Her daughter would have been about the same age as Mason and Henry now if she'd lived, 3 years old, learning to talk in full sentences probably, starting to assert her independence, discovering the world. Instead, Samantha was here, watching someone else's children grow. Gerald rubbed his face with both hands. He'd been awake for nearly 40 hours now, running on coffee and adrenaline, but he couldn't stop. He needed to understand, needed to see the full picture before he decided what to do next. His phone lit up with another message from his investigator. This time it included an attachment, financial records. Gerald opened the file and began to read. Samantha's salary as a paramedic had been modest but stable, £32,000 a year, decent for London though not extravagant. After she'd left the ambulance service in December 2022, 3 months after the accident, her income had dropped significantly. She'd worked 2 jobs, one at a pediatric clinic as a medical assistant, £18,000 a year, and another stocking shelves overnight at a Tesco, £12,000 a year, £30,000 total, working herself to exhaustion at 2 jobs that were both beneath her qualifications. But it was the outgoing transactions that made Gerald's hands stop moving on the keyboard. Every month without fail there were transfers, large ones, £1,500 in October 2022, £2,000 in November, £1,800 in December. The amounts varied, but they were always significant, always taking a huge portion of her meager income. The transfers went to an account Gerald didn't recognize. He forwarded the account number to his lawyer with a simple message: "Find out who this belongs to, fast." The response came Woe hours later while Gerald was watching the morning routine on the monitors. Samantha was helping the boys get dressed, a task that required patience and time. Mason could manage some of it himself if given enough space, but Henry needed more help. Gerald watched as she talked them through each step, turning it into a game, making them laugh even as they struggled. His phone rang. His lawyer's voice was careful, professional as always, but Gerald detected something underneath. Surprise, maybe. "Mr. Smith, that account number you sent me, I've traced it. And it's registered to your sons, both of them. It's a medical trust fund established anonymously 2 years ago." Gerald went very still. What? Someone has been making regular deposits into a fund designated for Mason and Henry's medical care. Therapy equipment, specialized medical devices, adaptive technology. The fund has been used to purchase several items over the past 2 years. How much? Gerald's voice was barely a whisper. The total deposited is £47,230. The room spun. Gerald gripped the edge of his desk. Who established the fund? It was set up anonymously through a solicitor's office. But based on the banking information you provided, the deposits are coming directly from Samantha Brown's personal account. Gerald ended the call. He sat in the silence of his office, staring at the monitors without really seeing them. £47,230. Nearly everything Samantha had earned over 2 years, working 2 jobs, barely making enough to survive in London, and she'd given it all away. To his sons. To children she'd pulled from a wrecked car, children whose mother had asked her to find them, to love them. She'd been preparing. For years before she ever walked through his door, she'd been preparing, making sure Mason and Henry had what they needed, funding their care from a distance. This wasn't a job to her. This wasn't even about keeping a promise anymore. This was something else entirely, something Gerald couldn't quite name because he'd never seen anything like it before. He thought about the caregivers who'd come before, the ones who'd stolen, who'd lied, who'd left. They'd all had their reasons, their justifications. They needed money, they needed recognition, they needed something from the Smith family. But Samantha had been giving long before she ever asked for anything in return. Gerald stood, walked to the window. Down in the garden he could see her pushing the boys' wheelchairs along the path, pointing out early spring flowers, letting them touch the petals. She was smiling, but even from this distance, Gerald could see the sadness that never quite left her eyes. She'd lost her daughter, lost her career, given away her savings, all for a promise made to a dying woman she'd never met before that night. Why, the question haunted him, why sacrifice everything? Unless Rachel had seen something in her that Gerald still couldn't see, or something he was too afraid to see. Over the next 3 days, Gerald watched more carefully than he ever had before, but he wasn't searching for evidence of deception anymore. He was searching for understanding. He watched through camera 4 every morning as Samantha woke before sunrise. She'd sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, her Bible open in front of her, lips moving in silent prayer. Gerald zoomed in once, close enough to see tears tracking down her face as she prayed. Was she praying for his sons, for the daughter she'd lost, for the strength to keep going? He watched as she prepared breakfast for the twins, not the elaborate meals the private chef left in the refrigerator, but simple things made with her own hands. Scrambled eggs with cheese the way Mason liked them, toast cut into triangles because Henry thought they tasted better that way, fruit arranged on their plates in the shape of smiling faces, silly and sweet and utterly unnecessary. But the boys loved it. Every morning they'd wheel themselves to the table and Mason would call out, "Sam, what face did you make today?" And Samantha would act surprised, like she hadn't spent 20 minutes carefully arranging strawberries and blueberries into elaborate designs. Gerald watched through camera 12 as she did their laundry, folding their small clothes with the same care she did everything else. She'd hold up each shirt, each pair of pants, smoothing out wrinkles with gentle hands. Once he saw her press one of Henry's sweaters to her face, breathing in the scent of little boy soap and sunshine. The expression on her face in that moment was so raw, so full of longing and loss that Gerald had to look away. He watched through camera 7 as she read to them every night, the same books over and over because the boys found comfort in repetition. The Very Hungry Caterpillar, Where the Wild Things Are, Guess How Much I Love You. That last one always made Samantha's voice catch on certain lines. I love you right up to the moon and back. She'd read, and Gerald could hear the tears she was holding back. But it was the small things that destroyed him. The way she'd automatically reach out to steady Henry's wheelchair when they went over a bump. The way she'd cut Mason's food into smaller pieces without being asked, knowing he had trouble with motor control. The way she'd sit with them during their physical therapy, cheering every tiny accomplishment like it was a miracle. You moved your finger, did you see that, Henry? You did it. Mason, you held that position for 10 whole seconds, that's longer than yesterday. The therapists Gerald paid £200 an hour treated his sons with clinical detachment. They counted repetitions, marked progress on charts, and left at the end of their sessions. Samantha celebrated every tiny victory like it mattered, like the boys themselves mattered more than any medical chart. One afternoon, Gerald was reviewing security footage from the previous day when he stopped on a particular moment. Camera 7 again, the playroom. Samantha was sitting on the floor with both boys, not doing therapy, just sitting. She had a picture book open in her lap, but none of them were looking at it. Gerald turned up the volume. This one's about a little bird who lost his way home, Samantha was saying softly. But he kept flying, kept looking, and you know what? He found it. Henry leaned forward slightly. At 4 years old, he was usually the quieter of the twins, more withdrawn, but something in Samantha's voice seemed to reach him. Did he cry? Henry asked. Yeah, Samantha said. He cried a lot because being lost is scary and he missed his home. Mason, even quieter, whispered, Do you think Mama cried? The question hung in the air. Gerald held his breath, watching the screen. Samantha set the book down. She looked at Mason with eyes so full of tenderness it was almost painful to witness. I think she did, Samantha said softly. I think she cried because she didn't want to leave you, but I also think she knew something important. What? Mason's voice was barely audible. She knew you'd be okay because you're stronger than you know, both of you. Mason's face crumpled, but I'm not strong, I can't even walk. Gerald's chest tightened. He'd heard his son say this before, but it never got easier. Strong isn't about walking, Samantha whispered. It's about waking up every day even when you're sad. It's about trying even when things are hard. And you do that, Mason, every single day. She pulled both boys close, and Gerald saw her shoulders shake just once, like she was holding back tears of her own. Henry reached over and took his brother's hand. We're strong together, he said. And then something happened that Gerald hadn't seen in over a year. Mason smiled, small, fragile, but real. Gerald turned off the monitor. He couldn't watch anymore. He stood, walked to the door of his office down the hall. He had to know, had to ask her directly, had to hear from her own mouth why she'd done all of this. But when he reached the playroom door and looked through the window, he stopped. Because what he saw wasn't a caregiver doing her job. It was a woman mourning with his sons, grieving alongside them, like she understood their pain in ways no one else could, like she'd earned the right to sit with them in their sorrow because she carried her own. And Gerald realized something that terrified him down to his bones. She wasn't here to replace Rachel, she couldn't, no one could. She was here because Rachel had known in those final moments exactly what her sons would need. Not a replacement mother, not a professional caregiver who would go through the motions, but someone who understood loss, someone who knew what it meant to have your world shattered, someone who would love his boys not in spite of their brokenness, but because she was broken too. Rachel had sent them someone who could meet them in their grief and say, I know, I understand, and we're going to be okay. Gerald didn't go into the playroom that day. He turned around, walked back to his office, closed the door. He needed time to think, to process everything he discovered. But the truth was starting to terrify him. Because his sons were already attached to Samantha, he could see it in the way they smiled when she entered a room, the way they called for her when they needed comfort, the way they'd started calling her Sam like she was family. And what happened when she left? Because everyone left eventually. That was the one thing Gerald had learned in 3 years. Everyone had their breaking point, their moment when the reality of caring for two traumatized, disabled children became too much. Samantha had sacrificed more than anyone, which meant she'd eventually want something in return. And when Gerald couldn't or wouldn't give it to her, when she realized this job was too hard, too emotionally draining, too much, she'd leave. And it would destroy Mason and Henry. All over again. Better to end it now, Gerald thought. Better to protect them before they got even more attached, before losing Samantha became another trauma they'd have to survive. He made the decision that night, sitting alone in his office at 2 a.m. He'd let her go, give her a generous severance, a glowing reference, anything she needed. But she had to leave before his sons' hearts became so intertwined with hers that losing her would break them. The next evening, Gerald found Samantha in the kitchen. The twins were already in bed, the house quiet. She was making tea, standing at the counter with her back to him. You were there, Gerald said. The words came out harder than he'd intended. Accusatory. Samantha's hand froze on the kettle. She turned slowly, and when she saw what he was holding, the photograph from her room, her face went pale. Yes, she said quietly. You pulled them out of the car. I did. My wife spoke to you. Gerald's voice shook despite his efforts to control it. Samantha's eyes filled with tears. She nodded. What did she say? The words burned coming out. Tell me exactly what she said. Samantha set the kettle down, took a breath that sounded painful. She was in the front seat, Samantha began, her voice barely above a whisper. Badly hurt, the steering column had. She stopped, swallowed hard. We all knew she wasn't going to make it, but she was still conscious, still fighting. Gerald's hands were shaking. He gripped the photograph tighter. When we got Mason and Henry out, Samantha continued, tears streaming down her face now. When I told her they were alive, that they were breathing, she grabbed my wrist. Grabbed it so tight I had bruises for weeks. What did she say? Gerald asked again, his voice breaking. She looked at me and she said, if I don't make it, promise me you'll find my boys. Promise me you'll love them the way I would have. Samantha's voice cracked. I promised her, right there in the middle of the road with her blood on my hands, I promised. The photograph slipped from Gerald's fingers, fell to the floor. And your baby, the words came out harsh, cruel. You lost your baby that night. Samantha flinched like he'd struck her, a sob escaped raw and broken. The trauma, she whispered. It triggered early labor. My daughter was born at the hospital while your sons were in surgery. She wiped her face with shaking hands. She lived 20 minutes. I held her, and the whole time all I could think was, at least I saved someone else's children. Gerald couldn't breathe. The pain in her voice, the weight of what she was saying, it was too much. Why didn't you tell me? He demanded. Why hide it? Because I didn't come here for sympathy, Mr. Smith. Samantha's voice steadied despite the tears. I came because I made a promise to a dying mother, and your sons deserved someone who'd fight for them the way she would have. The money, Gerald said, and he heard how cold his voice sounded. The equipment, that was you. They needed it. You gave everything, £47,000, your entire savings. They were worth it. The silence that fell between them was unbearable. Gerald looked at her, really looked, and saw someone who'd sacrificed more than he could comprehend, someone who'd kept a promise that most people would have forgotten within days. And it terrified him. Because his sons loved her, and if she left, if she betrayed them like everyone else, they wouldn't survive it. I need you to go, he said. Samantha's face shattered, the color drained from her cheeks. Mr. Smith. Pack your things, I want you gone by mornings. Please let me explain. You came here under false pretenses, Gerald said, and he hated how cold his voice sounded, how controlled. You had a personal connection to my family that you deliberately concealed. That's grounds for immediate termination. I came here because your wife asked me to, Samantha's voice rose slightly, because she looked at me in her last moments and trusted me. My wife is dead, Gerald exploded. The words burst out of him loud and raw. And you've been using my sons to heal from your own loss. That's what this is, isn't it? You lost your baby and now you're trying to replace her with Mason and Henry. Don't, Samantha's voice cut through, quiet but firm, don't do that. But Gerald couldn't stop. Fear made people cruel and he was drowning in it. You manipulated your way into our lives, made yourself indispensable. And what happens when you leave, Samantha? What happens when you get what you need from them and walk away? I would never. Everyone leaves, Gerald's voice broke. Everyone, and when you do, it will destroy them. From down the hall came a small voice, Sam. They both froze. Mason awake listening. Where's Sam going? Henry's voice joined his brother's. Samantha's face crumpled. She moved toward the hallway, but Gerald stepped in her path. Don't, oh, he said. She looked at him and the pain in her eyes was unbearable. But she turned toward the hall anyway, knelt down even though she couldn't see the boys from where she was. I love you both so much, she said, her voice shaking but clear. You remember that, okay? You're strong, you're brave, and your mama is so proud of you. Don't leave, Mason's voice was desperate now, crying. Please don't leave us. Stay, Sam, Henry begged, please stay. Samantha covered her mouth, her whole body shaking with sobs she was trying to hold back. Gerald stood frozen, listening to his sons beg, watching this woman break in front of him. And he said nothing. Samantha stood, wiped her face with trembling hands, looked at Gerald one last time. I kept my promise, she whispered. I hope someday you'll understand that. She walked past him up the stairs. 15 minutes later, she came back down with the same small suitcase she'd arrived with. She didn't look at Gerald as she walked to the front door, didn't pause, didn't say anything else. The door closed behind her with a soft click. And the silence that followed wasn't relief, it was devastation. Gerald stood in the entryway alone, listening to his sons cry in their room down the hall. He'd gotten what he wanted: control, safety, protection from the risk of losing anyone else. But the house felt emptier than it ever had before, and somewhere deep in his chest, a voice whispered words he wasn't ready to hear. What have you done? The house had always been quiet, but the silence after Samantha left was different. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of life. Gerald tried to maintain normalcy. The next morning, he prepared breakfast himself for the first time in months. Eggs, toast, orange juice, simple things. He brought the plates to the dining room where Mason and Henry sat in their wheelchairs, staring at nothing. Eat, he said, trying to sound encouraging. You need your strength. Neither boy moved. Mason, Henry, please eat. Mason looked at him with eyes that held something Gerald had never seen directed at him before. Not anger, not even sadness, betrayal. You made her leave, Mason whispered. The words hit Gerald like a physical blow. I did what was best. You made her leave, Henry echoed, his voice hollow. Both boys turned away from him, faced the wall, and wouldn't look at him again. The eggs grew cold. Gerald cleared the plates an hour later untouched. By the third day, the twins had stopped eating almost entirely. Gerald tried everything. Their favorite meals, new foods, letting them choose whatever they wanted, but Mason and Henry just stared at their plates with empty faces and pushed them away. Where's Sam? Mason asked every morning. And every morning, Gerald didn't have an answer that would make sense to a 4-year-old. By the 5th day, they'd stopped asking. And that was worse. They sat by the window in their wheelchairs for hours, staring out at the street like they were waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. They didn't play, didn't talk, didn't cry anymore. They just existed in a state of numb grief that reminded Gerald too much of the months after the accident. He'd broken them again. Gerald tried to hold them to comfort them, but when he reached for Mason, his son pulled away. I want Sam, was all Mason would say. That night, Gerald's investigator called. Mr. Smith, I've completed the full background check you requested on Samantha Brown. And Gerald's voice was flat. Everything checks out. She was the lead paramedic on scene the night of your wife's accident. Her name is on all the incident reports. The hospital records confirm she was admitted that same night for the obstetric emergency. We also verified the medical trust fund. Every pound came from her personal account. The investigator paused. We even had a handwriting analyst compare the note on the back of that photograph to samples from your wife's journals. Gerald closed his eyes and... It's a match, sir. Those were definitely your wife's words. Everything Miss Brown told you is true. Gerald hung up the phone, sat in the silence of his office. She hadn't lied, not about anything. She'd sacrificed her career, her savings, her own grief, all to keep a promise to a woman she'd met for minutes in the worst moment of both their lives. And Gerald had sent her away, called her a liar, accused her of manipulation. Because he was terrified, because trusting someone meant risking loss and he'd already lost too much. But now, listening to his sons cry themselves to sleep for the fifth night in a row, Gerald realized something. He hadn't protected them by pushing Samantha away. He'd broken them. The next evening, Gerald stood in the doorway of the twins' room. Mason was already asleep, exhausted from crying. Henry lay awake, staring at the ceiling. "Henry," Gerald whispered. His son didn't respond, didn't even look at him. "I'm sorry," Gerald said. His voice cracking. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake." "Still nothing." Gerald walked closer, knelt beside Henry's bed. "Your mama asked Sam to find you, to take care of you, and I sent her away because I was scared, but that wasn't fair to you, or to Sam, or to your mama's wishes." Henry finally looked at him, his eyes were red from crying. "Can you make her come back?" he whispered. "I don't know," Gerald admitted, "but I'm going to try." He stood to leave, but Henry's small hand reached out, grabbed his. "Daddy." Gerald froze. Henry hadn't called him that in months. "Bring her back," Henry said, "please." Gerald squeezed his son's hand, nodded, because he couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. He went to his office, pulled out his phone, stared at Samantha's number. He should call, apologize, beg her to come back. But before he could dial, an alarm shrieked through the house. The medical monitor, Mason's room. Gerald ran. Gerald burst through Mason's bedroom door, and the scene that greeted him stopped his heart. Mason wasn't moving. His face had a bluish tinge, his eyes were rolled back, and his small body lay limp in the bed. "Mason," Gerald grabbed his son's shoulders, shook him gently. "Mason, wake up." "Nothing." Henry was screaming from his bed. "Daddy, Daddy, what's wrong with him? Help him." Gerald's hands were shaking so badly he could barely function. His medical training all those years ago vanished from his mind. All he could see was his son dying, and he couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything. He fumbled for his phone, nearly dropped it twice. He didn't dial 999s, he didn't call the hospital. His fingers found Samantha's number before his brain had consciously made the decision. She answered on the first ring. "Gerald." Mason's not breathing, his voice was raw with panic. I can't." "Listen to me," her voice was calm, professional, cutting through his terror. "Is his airway clear?" "I don't know, I don't." "Turn him on his side, right now, do it." Gerald's hands obeyed even as his mind spiraled. He turned Mason onto his side. "I'm coming," Samantha said. "Keep him on his side, I'm already in the car, 6 minutes." The line stayed connected. Gerald could hear the sound of her car engine, the GPS directing her. "Talk to me, Gerald, is he breathing at all?" I don't think so, his face is blue." "Check his mouth, is there anything blocking his airway?" Gerald looked, his hands trembling. "I don't see anything." "Okay, tilt his head back slightly, support his jaw, I'm 3 minutes away." 3 minutes felt like 3 hours. Gerald held his son, watching for any sign of breath, any flicker of life. Henry was still crying, terrified, and Gerald couldn't comfort him because he was falling apart himself. Then he heard it, the front door slamming open, footsteps running through the house. Samantha appeared in the doorway, still in pajamas with a coat thrown over her shoulders, hair undone, face set with fierce determination. "Move," she said. Gerald scrambled back. Samantha dropped to her knees beside Mason's bed, her hands moving with the practiced precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. She checked his airway, positioned his head, placed 2 fingers under his jaw. "He aspirated," she said, her voice still calm. "Henry, look at me." Henry's tear-streaked face turned toward her. "Your brother is going to be okay. I need you to be brave for 2 more minutes. Can you do that for me?" Henry nodded, still crying but quieter now. Samantha cleared Mason's airway with swift, precise movements, tilted his head back, gave 2 rescue breaths. Gerald watched, useless as she worked. 15 seconds, 30, every second felt like an eternity. 45 seconds. Then Mason coughed, gasped, his chest rose with a shuddering breath. Color flooded back into his face. Samantha held him, monitoring his breathing, one hand on his small chest, the other cradling his head. "You're okay," she whispered. "I've got you, you're safe now." Mason's eyes fluttered open, confused and scared. "Sam," his voice was so small, so fragile. "I'm here, sweetheart, I'm right here." Gerald collapsed against the wall. A sob tore out of him, raw and guttural, all the terror and relief and shame pouring out in one broken sound. The ambulance arrived 8 minutes later. Paramedics who knew Samantha, who respected her, took over with professional efficiency. Good work, Sam, one of them said quietly. You saved his life. Mason was stable. They'd transport him to the hospital for observation, make sure there was no lasting damage, but he was out of danger. As they prepared to load Mason into the ambulance, Henry grabbed Samantha's hand and held it tight. Don't leave again, he whispered, his voice breaking. We need you. Samantha looked at Gerald, her eyes held pain, exhaustion, and something else. A question. And Gerald, broken and humbled and destroyed by his own pride, finally understood. She hadn't come to their lives to take anything. She'd come because Rachel had known that her sons would need someone who'd give everything, someone who'd show up even after being pushed away, someone who'd keep a promise even when it cost her everything. She was the answer to a prayer Gerald didn't know his wife had made in her dying moments. And he'd almost lost her. The hospital corridor was sterile and cold, all fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell. Gerald sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, still wearing the clothes he'd thrown on when the alarm sounded. Samantha sat 3 seats away, exhausted, hair still loose from sleep, her coat wrapped around her pajamas. Mason was in a room being examined by doctors. Henry was with him, refusing to be separated from his brother. The medical team had assured them both boys were fine, but they wanted to keep Mason for observation. Gerald couldn't stop looking at Samantha. She'd saved his son's life, dropped everything, driven through London in the middle of the night, and saved Mason without hesitation. Even after everything Gerald had said to her, even after he'd thrown her out. You saved his life, Gerald finally said, his voice rough. I kept my promise, Samantha replied quietly. Gerald moved to the chair beside her. His hands were shaking again, but not from fear this time, from shame. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. I don't know how to trust people. I don't know how to let someone in without feeling like I'm losing control of everything. Samantha looked at him and her eyes, despite everything, were kind. Control won't keep them safe, Gerald, she said gently. Love will. I said terrible things to you, I accused you of. You were scared, Samantha interrupted. I understand that. I'm still scared, Gerald confessed. Every single day, scared of losing them, scared of failing them, scared of letting anyone close enough to hurt them again. So am I, Samantha said quietly, every single day, but I'm here anyway. Silence settled between them, not the heavy, terrible silence of Gerald's house, but something different, honest. Why, Gerald asked. After everything I said, after how I treated you, why did you come back? Why answer the phone? Samantha's voice was soft but steady. Because your wife looked at me in her last moments and trusted me with the most important thing in her world. She didn't know me, had no reason to believe I'd keep that promise, but she asked anyway and I gave her my word. She looked at Gerald and he saw tears in her eyes. I wasn't going to break that promise, not for anything, not even for my own pain, not even when you sent me away. Gerald's throat burned. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Maybe not, Samantha said honestly, but your sons deserve a father who's brave enough to accept help, to let people love them, to trust that not everyone will leave. How do I do that? Gerald's voice cracked. How do I learn to trust again? One day at a time, Samantha said. The same way I'm learning to live with my grief, the same way your sons are learning to live with theirs, one moment, one choice, one small act of faith at a time. A nurse appeared in the doorway. Mr. Smith, the boys are asking for you both. They walked together to Mason's room. Both twins were in the same space now, Mason in the hospital bed, Henry's wheelchair pulled up beside it. When they saw Gerald and Samantha enter together, relief flooded their small faces. Gerald knelt between them, taking their hands. I need to tell you both something, he said, his voice shaking. Sam didn't just come to take care of you. Your mama, before she died, she asked Sam to find you, to love you, and Sam has been trying to do that from the very beginning. Mama sent her, Mason's eyes widened. Yes, Gerald whispered. Your mama knew exactly what we'd need, even when I was too scared to see it. Then why did you make her leave? Henry's voice was still accusatory, but softer now. Gerald's tears fell freely. Because I was so afraid of losing anyone else that I pushed away the person your mama knew we needed most. And that was wrong, I was wrong. He looked at Samantha, standing in the doorway. I'm sorry, he said, for everything, for not trusting you, for the things I said, for sending you away when all you were trying to do was keep a promise to someone you barely knew. Samantha stepped forward, knelt beside the beds. I need to tell you both something too, she said gently. I lost my daughter the night I pulled you from that car. She would have been about your age now if she'd lived. The boys listened, their eyes wide. And for so long, I thought that meant I'd never get to be a mom, Samantha continued, her voice thick with emotion. But your mama, she gave me the greatest gift. She trusted me with you. She gave me a chance to love again even when my heart was broken. Like a mom's, Henry asked quietly, hopefully. Zod. Mantha's breath caught, tears streamed down her face, if that's what you want. Both boys reached for her at the same time. Samantha gathered them as close as she could with Mason in the hospital bed, holding them both while they cried together. Gerald watched from beside the bed, and finally, he saw what Rachel had seen that night on the dark motorway. Not just a paramedic trying to help, not just a caregiver doing a job, but the person God had chosen to put their broken family back together, someone who understood their pain because she carried her own, someone who knew what it meant to lose.